My family was always, the rules were always challenge people in power and defend people with less power, and that's it.
George Clooney married Amal Alamuddin this year.
It was easy. It was the minute she walked in the door, I was just, taken by her. And the fun part was, I didn't know whether, she would like me or any of those things. And then
Wait, George, stop it.
And then we went.
Know if Amal would like you.
Ever since his infamous role in ER as Dr. Doug Ross, George Clooney has made his name unforgettable and positioned himself as a Hollywood A-lister. But behind his many achievements, his life has been marked by many tragedies. What happens when one of Hollywood's most powerful men suddenly finds himself broken and nearly forgotten? And when the cameras stop rolling, is George Clooney still the legend with a charming smile?
Mr. and Mrs. Clooney.
Hello.
My goodness, you brought out the sparkles.
And I got a call from my agent who called me and said, I met this woman who's coming to your house who you're going to marry.
Whoa.
I was on my knee for like 20 minutes. I finally said, look, I'm going to throw my hip out.
Or is he just another man scarred by life's cruelty? Join us as we unveil the heartbreaking and tragic story of 64-year-old George Clooney. In the beginning. George Clooney was born on the 6th of May, 1961, in a small town called Lexington, Kentucky. His family was charming, a former beauty queen turned councilwoman, a television host, a gentle girl with a knack for numbers, and then there was little George. Despite how little their hometown was, George was surrounded by cameras from a young age, but none were as bright as the lights that awaited him in Hollywood. As a boy, George went to Blessed Sacrament School in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky. And when his family moved to Ohio, he became a student of St. Michael's School in Columbus. He wasn't top of class, but he worked hard, and by the time he reached middle school, George was just like any other teenager, hopeful about the future and trying to find his place in the world. However, he had no idea the tragedy that was about to strike. Towards the end of middle school and the beginning of his high school years, George developed a condition called Bell's palsy. This condition caused the left side of his face to become paralyzed. He could not smile or blink properly, and sometimes, when he drank milk, it would drip from his mouth uncontrollably. It was a difficult time for young George. The other kids at school teased him mercilessly until George started making fun of himself. Fortunately, it cleared up in 9 months. For George, those months were the worst time of his life. But little did he know what fate had in store for him. What other tragedy could be worse than a 9-month paralysis for George?
Amal, whatever alchemy it is that brought us together, I couldn't be more proud to be your husband.
They made it 10 years. Congratulations, you two.
That's right.
How to be a man. George Clooney grew up with a love for sports. Baseball, in particular, was his passion. He practiced often, dreaming that maybe one day he could play in the big leagues. And when tryouts came, he gave it everything he had and crossed his fingers for the best. But it turned out that his love for the game was not enough. He needed exceptional skills. And sadly, his skills were not enough. This broke George's heart. He had hoped sports would be his path, but that dream was now gone. Still, he didn't give up easily. After finishing high school, George went on to Northern Kentucky University. At first, it looked like he was following the usual road: study hard, graduate, and build a career. But deep down, George was struggling to stay focused. Sitting through classes didn't interest him the way chasing a ball once had. Before long, he drifted away from lectures and exams and began to lean toward business and entrepreneurship. He started by selling women's shoes as a way to make a living. He even worked as a door-to-door salesman, using his charming looks to convince strangers to buy insurance. Wherever opportunity appeared, George chased it with high hopes that one small venture would open doors to something bigger. maybe that was what he thought had happened when he got into the tobacco business. George started by cutting tobacco in Kentucky fields. It was a back-breaking work under the hot sun and generated barely enough income. So he decided to take it to another level. Tobacco was common, and plenty of people wanted it. So George started to sell it. It worked. He was finally living a comfortable life, but soon life would show him how dangerous this path could be. It started with his uncle Joe, who became sick and later passed away from lung cancer, an illness tied directly to tobacco use. George was shaken. He wasn't just selling tobacco, he was also using a lot of it. The mortality attributed to it made him reconsider his life choice, and eventually, George stopped selling tobacco. Over the years, he lost a total of 8 aunts and uncles to the same disease, and each loss was like opening up a wound that reminded him of the business he had once chosen. With his closed business, George was back to square one, searching for his purpose. But what was he missing, and how far was George from his destiny? The test of patience. By his early 20s, George Clooney was restless. He had tried school, tried sports, and tried business, but nothing felt like the path he was meant to follow. But when he looked back at his background, the answer almost seemed obvious. He had grown up surrounded by cameras. His mother, Nina Bruce, had once been a beauty queen and even served as a city councilwoman. His father, Nick Clooney, was a well-known broadcast journalist, comfortable in front of the lens. And even more powerful was the influence of his aunt, Rosemary Clooney, the famous singer and actress whose voice and face had left its mark on Hollywood before she lost her life to lung cancer. Maybe, George thought, acting was his chance to finally belong. So, at 21 years old, George packed up and moved to Los Angeles. But Hollywood was not waiting with open arms. For years, George faced rejection after rejection. He went to auditions where directors barely looked up from their papers and tried out for roles that slipped away into the hands of others. One of those roles that continued to hurt him for years was the role of J.D. in Thelma and Louise. He had auditioned 5 times only for it to go to Brad Pitt. The struggle was brutal. For a time, he lived in a friend's small apartment, sleeping in the closet because there was no other space. He didn't even own a car, so he rode a bicycle to auditions, pedaling through the city streets under the hot California sun. Yet most auditions ended with silence, and the ones that landed him parts barely paid the bills. But George continued to persevere. He appeared in several television shows meant to launch new series called pilots, but almost all of them failed before reaching the screen. He managed recurring roles in series like The Facts of Life and Roseanne, but they didn't bring him fame or lasting security. 12 long years passed this way. It was a test of patience that might have destroyed someone else's spirit. Yet George stayed. He told himself that maybe the next audition would bring the chance he had been waiting for. Then, in 1994, his life changed. George was cast as Dr. Doug Ross, a charming but troubled pediatrician, on NBC's new medical drama, ER. This was not another failed pilot. ER became an instant hit. Audiences across the country tuned in week after week, and suddenly, George was no longer invisible. His natural good looks, paired with the depth he brought to the role, made him a household name. His performance as Doctor. Ross earned him 2 Emmy nominations. Success had finally come, and he could now relax. But what was going on in George's personal life? Finding love like a needle in hay. In 1989, while still in his struggling days, George got married to Talia Balsam. He was just 28 at that time, and it seemed like he had found some stability. But in 1993, just a year to his fame, their marriage ended and George swore himself off marriage or fatherhood. He even made bets with Michelle Pfeiffer and Nicole Kidman to show how much he meant business. From 1993 Till 2007, George had 11 different and sometimes overlapping relationships with people like Ginger Lynn Allen, Lisa Snowden, and Linda Thompson. In 2007, George entered a new relationship with Sarah Larson, a former cocktail waitress. For a moment, it appeared different. But during this time, George also experienced one of the darkest chapters of his life. While filming a scene, he was tied to a chair as part of the script. The stunt required the chair to be kicked over. Something went wrong. The impact caused George to hit the floor hard, and while it seemed like a simple fall at first, something terrible had happened. The fall tore his dura mater, the protective layer around his spinal cord and brain, and this tear allowed spinal fluid to leak into his brain. Soon after, George began experiencing unbearable headaches. These weren't ordinary headaches, they were so violent that they left him lying in bed, unable to move without feeling like his skull was splitting. Doctors treated him for months, but the pain never fully disappeared during that time. In fact, George later confessed that the agony was so overwhelming, he even thought about suicide. For a man who seemed so confident on screen, behind closed doors, he was crushed by an agonizing pain he couldn't control. When his relationship with Sarah Larson ended, George moved forward, even though the effects of that injury remained with him. He next dated Italian actress Elisabetta Canalis, a relationship that lasted 3 years. For a while, they seemed happy, appearing together at events and vacations. But by 2011, it ended. Soon after, George began dating Stacy Keibler, a former professional wrestler and actress. This relationship lasted 2 years, until July 2013. While it seemed like George was having the time of his life with all his romances, there was a sadder story hidden in the details. Love seemed to slip through his fingers no matter how many times he reached for it. By the end of 2013, George had all the money and fame he wanted, but also felt an emptiness only a soulmate could fill. After this really long string of failed relationships, can George ever find true happiness? A happily ever after. When George announced his engagement to Amal Alamuddin, an accomplished international human rights lawyer, in 2014, the world was shocked. News began to spread like wildfire that Hollywood's most famous bachelor was finally settling down. Unlike the models, singers, and actresses George had dated in the past, Amal was different. In her field, she was deeply respected, and her looks were always elegant. Some people didn't believe it. They thought it was a spur of the moment for George, but then, 5 months after their engagement, the two were married in a small yet glamorous ceremony in Venice, Italy. For 53-year-old George, marriage at last felt right. After years of believing he wasn't meant for it, he found himself beside someone who challenged him and made him want to be better. 3 years later, in 2017, George and Amal announced that they were expecting twins, and in June of that year, their children, Ella and Alexander, were born. For George, holding his babies in his arms was an almost unreal moment. He had waited so long for this kind of happiness, and now, in his mid-50s, it had finally arrived. Everything seemed surreal, as if life had decided to finally reward him for all the pain he had endured. But tragedy was never far from George Clooney's story. In July 2018, only a year after becoming a father, George was riding his motorcycle in Sardinia when disaster struck. A car hit him at high speed, throwing him over the handlebars and slamming him into the car's windshield. The impact was so violent that it shattered the glass. George was lucky to be alive, but he was left badly injured. Recovery was slow. He had already lived through spinal fluid leaks and endless headaches from a past accident, and now his body carried fresh wounds. On top of this, George had long suffered from stomach ulcers, a lifelong condition that flared under stress and exhaustion. Together, the injuries and illnesses had a huge effect on his quality of life, and the doctors could only remind him to take it easy on his body, as he was now a man in his late 50s. The crash also changed how George thought about his responsibilities. He was now a husband and a father, and his children needed him alive, not reckless. So when COVID-19 hit in 2020, George took no chances, especially since his son Alexander had asthma, a condition that made the virus especially dangerous. George locked himself and his family inside their home. For 2 years, he barely stepped outside, refusing to risk his children's health for anything. To the public, it was a shock. This was George Clooney, the carefree global star, now living the life of a stay-at-home father. Even after the pandemic, he remained at home, cooking and cleaning for his children, while Amal continued her demanding work. In those years of isolation, George discovered a purpose greater than the ones he had searched for through work and relationships. It was pure devotion to his family. But when the noise from the fans gets really loud, what would be the legend's next step? When fame stings. George had always been a man who cared about public opinion, having lived a large chunk of his life under their constant gaze. However, something shifted in him after 2018. The motorcycle accident in Sardinia left him not only physically shaken, but emotionally scarred. As he lay on the ground, bloodied and disoriented, he realized that the world had changed in a way he wasn't prepared for. Instead of rushing to his aid, many bystanders reached for their phones, choosing to film his pain rather than help him. It took a near-death experience for George to realize the nature of modern-day fame, and he later admitted that the memory stayed with him, making him feel both exposed and dehumanized, as if his suffering was reduced to nothing more than entertainment for strangers. But his battles with invasive publicity did not stop there. George had long dealt with tabloid intrusion, yet one publication in particular drew his fiercest condemnation. The Daily Mail. In 2014, just before his wedding to Amal Alamuddin, the paper ran a sensational story claiming Amal's mother objected to the marriage on religious grounds. For George, the fabrication wasn't just insulting, it was reckless. In an op-ed for USA Today, he lashed out, saying the Daily Mail has made up an entirely fictitious story, and warned that their lies could actually endanger lives. Irresponsibility at this level is dangerous, he wrote. It's a lie, and it's dangerous. We have family members in Lebanon, and the idea that someone would write this and say it could endanger them is beyond irresponsible. It's reckless. The Daily Mail eventually removed the story and issued an apology, but George wasn't satisfied. He used the moment to shine a light on the tabloids' wider tactics, accusing them of a long history of fabricating harmful stories and profiting from falsehoods. Years later, in 2021, his frustrations with the Daily Mail reignited in an even more personal way. By then a father of twins, he and Amal were raising their children outside of Hollywood's glare. Amal's work as a human rights lawyer often put her in situations where the safety of their family was a genuine concern. When the Daily Mail began publishing unauthorized photos of their children, George took decisive action. He wrote an open letter asking outlets to refrain from distributing images of minors, stressing that such exposure put his children's lives at risk. He pointed to Amal's work against terrorist organizations and authoritarian regimes, arguing that publishing their children's faces made them potential targets. We cannot protect our children if any publication puts their faces on their cover, he pleaded. For George, these experiences collectively hardened his stance toward fame. He no longer cared about keeping up with the image people expected of him. What mattered was safeguarding his family and maintaining his dignity in a world that often blurred the line between celebrity and spectacle. But was George's days as an actor truly over? As night falls, Over the years, George has become more than just an actor. He has become a director and producer of his own movies, working at his own pace. Although his journey so far has been just as ambitious as his acting career, it has been far less consistent. His first film as a director, Confessions of a Dangerous Mind in 2002, was an uneven start and received mixed reviews. But George quickly followed it with Good Night and Good Luck in 2005, a black-and-white drama about journalist Edward R. Murrow standing up to Senator McCarthy. That film earned 6 Academy Award nominations, including one for George as Best Director. Even though it didn't break records at the box office, it was a triumph. As a producer, George co-founded Smokehouse Pictures, backing projects like Argo, which went on to win the Oscar for Best Picture in 2012. He also directed The Ides of March, a sharp political thriller that drew praise and even earned its own Academy Award nomination. But not everything worked. Leatherheads, a comedy about early American football, fell flat with audiences. And The Monuments Men, despite its star-studded cast, disappointed critics who found it slow and unfocused. Nowadays, 64-year-old George has become even more than all that. He has become a man unafraid to risk his reputation by speaking his truth, even when it invites backlash. For example, George has stepped more firmly into the political arena, using his voice not just as a celebrity, but as an advocate. While he has always supported Democratic candidates through donations and fundraisers, his involvement grew sharper and more outspoken in the last few years. He began writing op-eds, speaking at events, and making it clear that he was no longer satisfied with standing on the sidelines. In 2024, George made one of his boldest moves yet when he published a deeply personal op-ed in the New York Times, urging President Joe Biden to step aside from the presidential race. He has long admired Biden, but he felt the country needed a stronger chance at change. And he also argued that the Democratic Party needed fresh leadership to stand a real chance in the upcoming election. This was a bold and controversial move, and the controversy grew when MSNBC's Morning Joe host Mika Brzezinski suggested that former President Barack Obama had encouraged George to write the piece. Immediately, George firmly denied this, emphasizing that the opinion was entirely his own. For him, it was proof that he was ready to stand his ground, regardless of public opinion or political pressure. For a man who had survived heartbreak, betrayal, and relentless public scrutiny, speaking truth to power no longer frightened him. If anything, it gave him peace. Do you believe George Clooney has finally found peace, or is there still another battle waiting for him? What do you think about his legacy so far? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.